So it's be able to actually develop a critical perspective and alternative ways of framing. Now, that can happen when recipient countries in the South talk to each other and share the lessons.
Hello and welcome to Development Reimagine's Decolonizing Development video series. My name is Etsehiwot Kebret and I'm a Development Finance Advisor at Development Reimagined. In this series, we seek to provide an insight into what does it mean to decolonize development, what results will this have, and what does change look like, and how do we, in all parts of the world, whatever racial, gender, disciplinary, social, or other background, drive change. We've seen that development, health, and humanitarian organizations of various sizes are reflecting, becoming more transparent about these issues, and recognizing that they need rebalancing. But what next? How do we change a buzzword into real, tangible action? If you don't already know, Development Reimagined is a leading, independent, and African-led international development consultancy, with our headquarters in China and with offices in Kenya and the UK. Our mission is to provide new ideas and solutions to deal with the complexities of global poverty and climate change, and it's a mission our diverse team really strives for every day. For this session, I am very excited to have our distinguished guest, Dr. Vivian Lin, who will share her insight on one of the key themes of what it means to decolonize development, dismantling the white gaze. But first, what do we at Development Reimagined mean by the white gaze? The white gaze is a term to describe how the experiences and desires of white power structures and white people are prioritized and viewed as the lens for development. It is a term that implies them and us. To paraphrase Robtel Najee Paley, a renowned Liberian academic and author, the white gaze of development takes their political, economic, and social processes as a norm while relegating non-white systems as lesser or inferior. In development, this is done all the time, and it also means we don't question the white northern systems and leave out real non-white experiences from development narratives, like colonialism itself. So what does Dr. Lin have to say about this?
I'm Vivian Lin, presently Executive Associate Dean at University of Hong Kong Faculty of Medicine, and also Professor of Public Health Practice. Previous to Hong Kong, I was the Director for Health System Development at the Western Pacific Regional Office of the WHO, and I worked for 13 years previous to that as the Chair of Public Health at La Trobe University in Melbourne, but also before that in government. And so along the way, I've done a lot of development assistance projects with the World Bank, with DFID, with AusAid, etc.
Dr. Vivian Lin, thank you very much for taking the time to have this discussion with us. Can you give any practical examples that have worked to reduce the impact of the white gaze? What made them successful?
I think that the most important thing in the development assistance context is actually for the so-called recipient countries to take control. Fundamentally, I think it's extremely difficult to change donor organizations, whether it's bilateral or multilateral. And so I think the only way to really do this properly, besides obviously having a broader conversation and trying to change the social norms, is actually for the people in the countries that are the recipients to take control. That means becoming the technical leaders. That means really driving projects in a way that's really useful to projects. It means pushing back when funding modalities don't work. It means when consultants are foisted on them and they're not appropriate, say they will never get another visa to come back to the country. It means saying, we're not going to take your money, we're going to look for another source of financing.
So how do you think that organizations can turn critical self-reflection into action? How do they actually change and decolonize?
the reason I think that this is unlikely to happen is because culture eats strategy for breakfast every day. And I think that there's too much entrenched interests and groupthink in organizations. And it's very difficult for people to really change the culture of bilateral donors, multilateral organizations. Because when people join these organizations, they actually kind of become part of the culture. But even when people become senior leaders, it's very difficult for them to change because of the external political and financial interests at stake. And so then, people get tired of trying to make changes and they move on to another organization. And then these organizations fall back to old practices, old habits. It's the second law of thermodynamics. So I think it's lucky for an organization to have critical self-reflection to start with. But whether that really, when you're bilateral, you're answerable to a minister. The minister is answerable to the larger government in terms of overall foreign policy interests. Organizations aren't going to win. And when you have multilaterals, again, it depends on where the money comes from. It depends on how the governance is structured.
And what can recipients do to tackle the white gaze, in your opinion?
Well, I think one of the things is for people to be developing a real sense of confidence and self-esteem, right? I mean, just because you went to postgraduate school in London or New York or somewhere doesn't mean you were taught the right thing. You were taught one perspective. So it's be able to actually develop a critical perspective and alternative ways of framing. Now, that can happen when recipient countries in the South talk to each other and share the lessons. I think countries can learn from each other in the way that they've had successes in pushing back or framing things differently. I think that, by learning history and experiences, then countries can start to set conditions for, what they will accept, what sort of consultants they will take, what sort of institutions they will work with. So I think countries talking to each other, sharing the problems and sharing the solutions is an incredibly important part of really gaining that kind of confidence so that you can really take control.
Definitely. And do you think that the global north can be incentivized to detect and divest soft power?
I think it's highly unlikely. I think that unless we have a major shift in the world order, we're not going to see change. Because really, so much of the development assistance is part of a soft power strategy. And so as long as countries have foreign policies, and they all do, this is going to be part of what they do. It's so that's one part of the problem. I think in many developing and recipient countries, you also have problems of elite interests, people who benefit from this particular structure, whether it's their organizations, their governments, or themselves personally, or their whatever. So I think that when we start to really understand the political economy of development assistance, then we see how enormously difficult it is to actually change.
So do you think anything can change? Is there anything that can disrupt the white gaze in development and lead to more equitable forms of cooperation?
I'll give you an early example I saw where one country was doing co-financing in China on a World Bank project. So this country proposed a particular model where there would be long-term advisors and short-term advisors. And the Chinese pushed back and said, we're not going to have that. And the consultant said, but this is how this country always works. This is what they do in every other country. And the Chinese said, sorry, we want the best that your country can offer. And the best is not going to take 3 years out of their career and come to China. So that's kind of just one example of how, they're not going to just be having someone foisted onto them. Another China example was a different bilateral donor, didn't even consult the Chinese and just started to do exactly what they do in other countries, which is to hire somebody who then could sit in the Ministry of Health. And the Chinese said, I'm sorry, but we don't do this in China. We don't take foreign nationals and put them in our government, in the ministry. And so this donor said, but we already have someone and he's ready to come. So the Chinese put him in another building where he had no contact with anyone until his contract finished and he left China. So, these are like the day-to-day operational things, but they do send signals. They send signals. And by the same token, countries can actually kind of do their homework. If there are suggestions about, a consultant, they could kind of look at what this person has done, look at any other sort of potential consultants, but better yet, they could think about, it's not about a consultant who drops in and, runs a training workshop for a week, but it's about how institutions can work together to really build capacity. So it may be an alternative form. And over time, the recipient might actually become the teacher because there's learning that works both ways. It just takes the kind of mutual respect and to really think about institutional relations. And when people have respect and they can listen and they can talk, they can work with each other, they solve problems for each other, they appreciate different mindsets, different frameworks, that will go a long way.
Absolutely, could not agree more. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, Dr. Lin, for joining us for this discussion. We've definitely gained a lot of food for thought, and we greatly appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.